Well, welcome. And if you came in during the video, I just want to make sure that you know that this tribute video is going to be available on our YouTube channel at the JFO. So we'll share that afterwards if you came in mid-celebration and wanted to either watch the whole thing in full, or you couldn't read through an entire letter's worth up on the page for 10 seconds. So we'll welcome you to see those greetings at a later time. And now I'd like to introduce our introducer, Alan Potash.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you to everyone who contributed to those wonderful comments. I'm Alan Potash, CEO for the Jewish Federation of Omaha. I'd like to welcome you all to a special program honoring Professor Leonard Greenspoon on the recent publication of his new book, Jewish Bible Translations, Personalities, Passions, Politics, and Progress. And I'm sure there's a great deal of humor and insight that we can learn from that book. In addition to celebrating his new book, we're also celebrating the significant role Leonard has played in bridging the relationships between Creighton University and the Omaha Jewish community. One of the areas has been the Klesnick Symposium, which unfortunately we're unable to have this year due to COVID. Over the past years, the Klesnick Symposium has showcased both Creighton University and the Omaha Jewish community to hundreds of scholars from around the world. I don't want to bruise anybody's ego here, but one of my favorite lectures, was the one on Jews and tattoos. It goes to the depth of what Leonard has been able to bring to Jewish leadership and learning and education. And I also agree with Michael Brode's comments as well. Steve Riekes and Jennie Gates Beckman came up with this idea to celebrate Leonard through a Zoom-posium and the release of his new book, and also to recognize Leonard's contributions to Jewish learning in Omaha, Nebraska. Leonard, over the years you've been in Omaha, your contributions have strengthened Jewish learning on a significant level. Today, we just want to say thank you. In addition, we invited a few people to share a thought or two. We shared that video earlier, and we'll make it available, as Jenny said, on YouTube. But before I turn it over to Leonard, I want to thank a few people who put today together: Steve Riekes, Jennie Gates Beckman, Jesse Taylor, Vanessa Gifford, and Carissa Hupke. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Omaha, Leonard, I want to thank you for your contributions and the continued work that you'll do for us. Now, I'll give you a chance to say a few words if you'd like. So, Leonard, it's your turn. And Leonard, you're muted.
Leonard, I can ask you to unmute, but you have to do it yourself.
Done? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All the better, thank you. On a Shabbat morning in mid-January 1959, after I completed chanting my Haftarah and the rest of the rituals that go with Bar Mitzvah, I was gifted by our synagogue, Congregation Bethel Conservative Synagogue in Richmond, Virginia, with a Jewish translation of the Bible. If this were a fantasy, I could say that I took that book and immediately immersed myself in it, and at that age decided, whoa, this is what I want to do for the next 50 years. Alas, that isn't what happened. I suspect I took the book reverently, put it on the shelf, and stayed there for many years. On the other hand, when I was thinking about this, I realized that the very fact that I can remember this from those many years ago, it must have made some impression on me. And I was trying to think when I first got interested in Jewish translations and Jewish translations of the Bible, and I'm not really sure, but I can remember the day as an undergraduate, I was majoring in classics, that I was looking through some reference book, and all of a sudden I saw this Septuagint. I doubt I could pronounce it correctly then. And I said, whoa, do you mean there's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible? This is amazing. And again, I don't know that's what started me with it, but that brought together my interest in the classics and my interest in Jewish studies. And The Septuagint is what I did my earliest work on, I did my dissertation on. I still write about it. And then over the years, in ways that just happened, perhaps serendipitously, I continued to be interested in Jewish translations of the Bible. And when I say, or when it's said, my book is the first book devoted to this subject, this is true. It's not to say that people haven't studied individual Jewish Bible translations, many of them for decades, if not for hundreds of years. But to bring it together as a development over 2,000 years, this is the first time it's been done. And what's been interesting to me is that my education as a graduate student in particular was very traditional, philological. It means we studied the text, the grammar, the comparative Semitics and what have you. But as soon as I continued to work on that, and I think that's a very important foundation, I found that I was as much interested in the translators themselves. And what is, I think, a reasonable contribution of this volume is to introduce to a large public a number of these translators. And we don't know those responsible for the earliest translations, the Septuagint in Greek or the Targums in Aramaic, but we know from then on, and it's an absolutely fascinating story. And it's something that I get passionate about, and it's part of that passion and excitement that I hope to convey in the volume. For reasons both obvious and maybe not so obvious, the languages that I've covered in the book, they run primarily in chronological order: the Greek, the Aramaic, the Arabic, Yiddish, German, Spanish, French, Italian, Hungarian, Russian, and English, with some references to Chinese. Some of this again is serendipitous, and some of it is fairly obvious. It is by its nature not exhaustive, but I think fairly representative. Now, a lot of times over the years, people have asked me, what do I think is the best translation? And I am concerned I'm probably disappointed, because I'm not able to give a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I know when I was a graduate student in particular, and rather pedantic, unlike the current me, I thought that only the more literal translation had any place, but that isn't entirely true. There's different styles of translation, each of which can be valuable in a given context. We used to speak of literal, if you will, versus free. Now we use somewhat different terminology. The more literal translation we tend to call a formal translation. And people who work in this along these lines believe that the form of the text, the original text, in this case Hebrew, is inextricably, it's one of my favorite words, inextricably connected with the form and the meaning are inextricably connected. So that when you bring into English a very different language from Hebrew, when you bring that into English, you try to maintain as much of the form of the Hebrew as possible. As a result, as with the King James Version and with the Jewish Publication Society version of 1917, it has sort of a foreign element to it. It's recognizably English, but it's not quite our English. Now, this makes sense because, after all, the Hebrew Bible, in addition to whatever else it is a product of 2,500 years ago, obviously different social, linguistic, cultural, and historical contexts. Reading a literal translation or formal translation imposes a certain amount of responsibility on the reader, because you have to stop and think about the text as you go through it. For some people, especially more recently, there's been what we call a functional translation or a freer translation. And this is the approach taken, by the way, by the translators of the JPS version that we continue to use, so-called New Jewish Translation Version. And their guiding principle or the guiding question is, what did the original writer of the text intend to say? How do we say it? And therefore, a translation like JPS is much less literal. It's not necessarily better or worse. So if I disappoint when I can't say this is the translation for everybody, hopefully I can enrich the discussion as we move along. So just a couple of other points fairly quickly. We often hear that really doesn't matter what translation you use, they're all the same. And one of the points that I bring up in the book that I don't think much attention has been given to is this is really not the case. So some of you may have studied with me on Yom Kippur, and we were talking about God's emotional life. And the Hebrew text is very direct. God gets angry a lot. And he smiles and is happy, but he's angry a lot. This is an emotion. What does this mean? How do we interpret it? Most translations record that in the translation literally, and then allow the reader, the commentator, to deal with that. But there are some translations, such as the Aramaic Targum and the Arabic text of Sajah Gaon, the Tafsir, where they've determined that God is immutable. This is the so-called God of philosophers. God does not change, and consequently, it's impossible that God would have any emotion. That's totally foreign. And when they did their translations, they took all of that out of it. To me, that's a mistake. I think that the reader of a translation should have access to as much of the information as the reader of the original in the original languages. And in fact, one of the concerns of the rabbis in the Talmud about Bible translation, they actually used a wonderful expression. They said a translation cooped up, if you will, the text as you might have a bird in a cage. Because the text, if you read the Hebrew Bible, it's one thing that I hope you notice, and that is it's open to lots of interpretations. And this is not by chance. This is the way it was written. And the rabbis were concerned the translators would lose that point. But that isn't necessarily the case. There's so many fascinating things about translation. And I just thought of one example. It's not biblical, but it points out, once you start thinking about it, what an intricate process translation is. So in this little snippet of a story, a professor's colleague calls up a professor. The son answers the phone. The person on the phone says, "Is your father home?" The little boy says yes and hangs up the phone. Okay, even though that's not our context, we know what happened. The question is not really, is your father home, but may I speak to him? The little boy didn't know that. So although we can hardly think of this as a deep theological point, we can ask ourselves, what would we do with that if we're translating that into another language? If we just translate it literally, it probably won't make sense. What does it mean he hung up? He's rude or something. And if you take that example, and this is actually an intra-English question, because it's not just, okay, we put it into English, but then how do we understand it and different levels of understanding? And it's just a multitude of choices. I've worked on translation, and sometimes I marvel that I can get from one verse to the other because there's so many possibilities. And yet, of course, people have done so successfully. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's an honor, but it's also humbling because it gives me a chance to talk about something which is underappreciated and overlooked. That is Jewish Bible translations. Typically, Jewish Bible translations have not been the subject of sustained talk because, after all, they are not meant to take the place of the original. And so people have said, well, they're only of secondary importance. So hopefully my volume will dispel this, this misunderstanding. In case you're wondering, up until a few minutes ago, when Marty had some very nice words to say, for which I'm deeply appreciative, The only other reviews of the book I've gotten were from my grand twins, Geffy and Shoshi, both of whom gave it full thumbs up and recommended it to their 5-year-old classmates at school. What more can I ask for? Again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to spending the rest of this afternoon learning with you. Thank you again, Jennie, Alan, Jesse, and all of those who are involved.
Thank you, Leonard. Jennie?
Thank you so much, Leonard. I was hoping you would share a bit of the praise that you had already received from your grand twins, because I did think that is always the most important, because family tells it to you honest, right? They could have said this, which is, you know, what I get frequently from my daughter. So I feel like you earned some great accolades with the thumbs up. So I just wanted to, before we transition into this next section of our time, I wanted to make the connection, like where did this come from? Why did we invite 2 other professors to come and sort of riff off of how their experiences in their work involve Bible translations, how Bible translations have impacted either their personal or professional work. And we specifically asked Professors Laura Alexander and Zachary Smith, not only because they're local, but because in my mind, they really embody one of the pieces of Professor Greenspoon's value in this community, is that they're the next generation of professors, right? So Leonard's going nowhere. He's promised me that he is not retiring for at least another 20 years. So it's not that this is saying, oh, this is what's coming next, but really seeing how he's incorporated the younger professors and the students of his work in the symposium, in his other programs that he's done throughout the community, has been really lovely. Not every professor does this. They certainly don't have to, right? And I think it's one of his strengths. So I'm really excited to invite on Dr. Laura Alexander first to speak, just in case you haven't met her before. Laura Alexander is at the UNO Department of Religious Studies, and she is the first recipient of the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights. So her research and teaching include comparative religious ethics, religion and immigration, and religious thinking about just war and national sovereignty. So I want to welcome her on, and I'm trying to find her so that we can spotlight her. I'll add you up here. Wonderful.
Good. Thank you. Okay, yes, thank you. I definitely want to thank Professor Greenspoon and also Ms. Beckman. Thank you, Leonard, and thank you, Jennie, for this invitation. I'm happy to have a chance to reflect for a few minutes on my own experiences of biblical translation and interpretation alongside friends and colleagues who are here. So to start my talk here, I want to say that I am squarely in that category of Christians for whom study of the Bible is always enmeshed with translation, as Leonard writes in the introduction to his work. I have been inspired to learn for years from attending my friend's bat mitzvah when I was in junior high and on up about how Jewish and Muslim communities retain such deep and careful study of the original language of scriptural texts. And I'm not saying that the Jewish relationship to the Bible is exactly the same as the Muslim relationship to the Quran, but both are certainly different than the Christian relationship to our scriptures. In fact, when Leonard says that Jewish Bibles in translation point to the original text rather than attempting to replace it, I actually hear resonances with the Protestant and particularly the Lutheran phrase that the Christian Bible, quote, points to Jesus. So I tell my students that when you compare Christianity and Islam, it's probably actually more accurate to compare not the Christian Bible and the Quran, but to compare Jesus as understood as the word of God in the Christian tradition and the Quran as the word of God in Islamic tradition. So, and of course, we would need to say much more, way much more, to work out the nuances of those comparisons, because those are huge, huge topics to talk about. But similarities and differences in the way that these traditions approach scripture is a topic that Leonard has really put his finger on, and that certainly merits more discussion. So the specific topic that I want to talk about in relation to my area of research and also my own moral concern is the topic of immigration and welcoming the stranger. Both Christian and Jewish activists and organizations in the United States draw on particular texts and language in relation to immigration. And these organizations, Christian, Jewish, and more, often do work together in interreligious movements. Although, of course, their concepts of welcome, stranger, and other terms are not precisely the same. The Bible mentions the stranger many times, and both the Israelites and the early Christians are told to welcome strangers. Both Christians and Jews point to Leviticus 19, 33-34, which commands the Israelites to treat the alien as the citizen, remembering their time in the land of Egypt. Christians also mention Matthew 25:35, when Jesus commends those who welcome strangers. But how does one interpret this? Who is the stranger, and what does welcome mean? Christiana Van Houten has conducted a thorough excavation and interpretation of the word ger, for which she says the best translation is alien, in the legal texts of the Torah. And she has shown that the meaning of that word seems to change in different time periods. Earlier on, the ger was understood to be a person, she says, who wasn't part of the Israelite community, but deserved compassion like any other member of a vulnerable group. Later, the ger was an alien who was known to be different, but who was integrated into political and religious life. Matthew 25 uses the Greek word xenos, meaning foreigner or, again, alien. So both texts do advocate compassion toward the alien, and both command that people take aliens into their homes and provide for them. The Torah is clearer than the Matthew passage about the possibility that an alien or foreigner might become part of the political community. The New Testament texts tend to be more, at least literally, about personal hospitality. So to be very brief, what this means for me in my scholarship on religion and immigration is that, not surprisingly, these terms and commands don't fit neatly into contemporary categories of migration, laws, and hospitality. They need interpretation, including considering how translation impacts our thoughts about the ger or xenos. So Van Houten again uses the term alien, and I think that she's persuasive that that's the right choice. But others have translated foreigner, sojourner, or again, simply stranger, and those all have different connotations for English speakers. Again, in biblical texts, whatever term you use to translate the words, there do seem to be particular themes, including compassion, mandates for at least charity toward the alien, and perhaps even actively taking that person into your home or political community, as well as recognition of the self in the other. You were once aliens in the land of Egypt. So both from a scholarly and a personal perspective, I take this to mean that whatever one thinks about immigration laws, border security, or legal categories like asylum, one should act out of a sense of charity and at least lean toward hospitality to the stranger. The laws of ancient Israel don't necessarily tell us everything about what contemporary laws should say, nor do the words of Jesus or Paul. But it seems to me that they encourage a general tendency toward crafting policies that, as far as possible, demonstrate hospitality and willingness to integrate outsiders into political and social communities. This continued engagement throughout the biblical text with the person of the ger and the interpretations and translations that have brought the stranger or the alien to the attention of so many people over centuries point, at the very least, to the importance of recognizing the needs of strangers who enter communities. The text addresses questions of migration and hospitality that continue to become more important as people get more mobile in general, and as the number of international migrants especially survival migrants and refugees, continues to rise. So that's such a brief thing to talk about. This is such a big issue, and to talk about translation interpretation in general, but I'll leave us there, and I'm happy to learn from my fellow panelists and from all of you as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So before we turn it over, I want to make sure I properly introduce our next speaker. So I'm gonna do some quick unspotlighting and get him on the screen. Oh, it's so much fun, this new world of Zooming, right? Okay, so Professor Zachary Smith is at the Creighton University Department of Theology, and he researches primarily in late antique, medieval, and Byzantine Christianity, focusing on asceticism and monasticism. I know, like, you can correct me. And the relationship between Christianity and Greco-Roman society. He is also the faculty associate of the Kripke Center and general editor of the Journal of Religion and Society. So I want to welcome Professor Zachary Smith to join us today and share some of his thoughts.
Thank you, Jenny. It is an honor to do this. When we moved to Omaha 5.5 years ago, my wife is originally from Lincoln, and we moved from New York, and we knew no one in Omaha. And I'd taken a position at Creighton, and I knew Leonard's work, I knew his reputation, and it was sometime in the winter of 2015, 2016. I guess it was December probably of 2015. And my phone rings, and it's Leonard. And we hadn't spoken yet. We hadn't really met yet. I was trying to balance a newborn and moving to a new town and a toddler. And my wife was adjuncting. She was also teaching at Temple Israel. And we were our life was chaotic and hectic. And Leonard called, and he introduced himself. And I stepped outside, and it was 20 degrees, and it was blowing snow. And we had the most wonderful 30-minute phone call. And I remember being so cold, but not wanting to get off the phone because he was such an inviting and engaging and welcoming person. It was really made me feel as a new faculty member at Creighton, welcome and new to the Omaha Jewish community, just really made us feel welcome here. And Leonard, thank you for that. That's gone a long ways for us surviving in a new town. I've had the pleasure of knowing Leonard now for 5.5 years. I've had the pleasure of seeing his students present and seeing the wonderful mentoring he's done. I've had the pleasure of working with him, presenting at the Klutznick Symposium, working with him on some of the things with the Rabbi Kripke Center for the Study of Religion and Society. For those of you who don't know, Leonard just received Creighton University Research Award, the university-wide Research Award, which is a major event. This is a university with 8 schools and colleges and is medicine and science heavy. So a humanities professor winning the University Research Award is a big deal, and it was a major accomplishment. And I'm very grateful to have Leonard as a friend and a colleague. And I want to talk for a little bit, just very briefly, about kind of a twist on something Leonard talked about in his book, which I've been enjoying reading. And it's the idea that the translation does not replace the original. And in my own work, and in where I'm kind of transitioning now in some larger histories of the Christian tradition, of the Christian religion, I'm curious as to what happens when the translation becomes the original for a community. So in particular, the Septuagint. And in my recent research, I've been interested to look at how early Christians have been using this translation as, for them, the text for understanding their origins. Now, in the classical world, in the classical antiquity and late antiquity, religions were significant if they carried with them the mark of antiquity. Now, when Christianity came onto the scene, Christianity was a brand new religion. It was a thing that people hadn't seen before. It did not look like Judaism in many ways. In some ways it did. In other ways, it looked a lot like the cult of Isis. In other ways, it looked a lot like the cult of Mithras, but it looked like this kind of new amalgam. And so one of the things Christianity tried to do was appeal to the antiquity of Judaism, and it did this in part through using the Septuagint. And it was the Septuagint that became the primary origin text for how Christianity understood itself. It copied some of the forms and some of the understandings. The Septuagint translation from Hebrew to Greek of Genesis 1, for example, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, it translates it, instead of Elohim, plural, it translates it as ho theos. The translator is making some kind of explicit claim about monotheism in a world that was increasingly looking toward Greco-Roman polytheism. And Christianity was trying to differentiate itself from the Greco-Roman world. And so in taking this translation, it was making a specific political claim about its place in the Greco-Roman world. The Septuagint also allowed Christians to create some of their most foundational doctrines. Without the Septuagint, Christianity could not have come up with the idea of the divinity of Christ. The divinity of Christ being an idea that was novel at the end of the first century, beginning of the second century, the idea that Jesus, who Christians called the Christ, was divine. This was only made possible through the text of John's gospel. John is making this argument, this novel argument at the end of the first, beginning of the second century. And he's able to do this only through appealing to the Septuagint beginning of Genesis 1. And he makes in the very beginning of this text an exact parallel between the Septuagint beginning of Genesis 1 and his understanding of who Jesus, who they're calling Messiah, who Jesus is in this newly developed religious idea. This then, in adopting the Septuagint, and then in adopting this kind of model of saying Jesus is Messiah, Jesus not just Messiah, but divine, based on taking the Septuagint, this translation, as their original, this then leads to 3 to 5 centuries of Christianity trying to figure out what in the world it believes. Is it a polytheistic religion, or is it a monotheistic religion? They end up arguing about this. They end up executing people over this. They end up exiling people over this for centuries, because they can't decide whether they believe in one God, 2 gods, or 3 gods, and on which day they're going to believe in which number of gods. And all of this comes from, all of this kind of problem, this problem of defining their core foundational belief, comes from the use of a translation. In taking this translation, taking the Septuagint as their origin, again, translations are not supposed to replace the original, but in the case of Christianity, the Septuagint does replace the original, and it becomes the original for Christianity. In doing that, Christianity sets itself up for letting go of centuries and centuries and centuries of commentary and understanding, and trying to interpret what the original texts were thinking about and speaking about, and sets itself up then for 5 centuries of argument over, are we polytheistic? Are we polytheists or monotheists? This is one of the ways that Jewish translations impact my own works. I'm trying to create some of these large-scale understandings of what Christianity is, what motivates Christianity to do some of the things it does, why it makes some of the strange turns that it makes into Greek philosophy, why it adopts some of the ideas of Roman Stoicism. And in some instances, this is because Christianity has adopted translation as its mode of operation. Leonard, congratulations. This is a beautifully written work, and your ability to weave scholarship into engaging stories is an inspiration, and it just makes it fun to read. Your book's not boring, and that's lovely.
It's a great compliment. I have to add, I was a little nervous, Professor Greenspoon, when I ordered the book, because it's been some time since I studied Near Eastern and Judaic studies and dove into actual nonfiction books for rigorous study, right? And so it was it was a joy to leaf through and see how all the different ways in which you wove stories about the actual translators into this. So I know Laura and Zach and I had spoken about having a conversation, a more conversational experience here, but I just realized I'd also love to invite you, Lenny, to respond if you want. So you don't have to right now, but I'm curious if there's anything that Professors Alexander or Smith said that is making you thoughtful. And I'm cognizant of some of the other scholars on the Zoom right now. So community members and scholars, if you have anything that you'd like to ask or riff off of, I'd invite that down the line. We'll just begin speaking if no one wants to step up, but I do want to allow Leonard the opportunity. So I'll unmute you. Can you press the button? Because we can't hear you. You still need, there we go.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am deeply appreciative of these comments and your ability to say so much in such a few minutes. Just two things that I thought of. In terms of Laura's presentation, I absolutely agree that alien is a fine translation, but I resist putting it in I resist putting it in Bible versions because alien often refers to outer space. Now, maybe that dates me. Well, obviously it does. But I worry about the use of the word alien there. At the same time, there's no other word, just as you pointed out, there's no other word that's quite like it. It's one of the joys and perhaps frustrations, depending on how you look at it, of translation. I mean, this word "ger" appears, I don't know, hundreds of times. It's one word out of tens of thousands of words in the Bible. It's an important word, and how you translate it matters. And so I appreciate our concentration on this. For Zach, it's interesting that one of the more current emphases in Septuagint studies is that initially, especially the 5 books of the Torah or the Pentateuch, which were done first, that they were done not to replace, but to accompany the Greek. And it is therefore appealing to think of an analogy between the use of the Septuagint at some point and the use of the Targums. So as you probably know, the Aramaic Targums were part of the worship service for centuries in synagogues. Someone would read the Torah, several verses at a time. Then someone would speak, you weren't allowed to read, but someone would speak the Targum. And this process was formalized for centuries. Now, we really don't know what went on in early synagogues. So we don't know if this actually occurred in any synagogue or whether the Septuagint functioned that way. But it's appealing to think of the Septuagint and translations, many of the translations in general, not as replacements, but as enhancements. So the version, the Greek version, which I believe was used in the synagogue in the same way that the Targum was used in later synagogues, in the same way that English is used in synagogues today, provides interpretive elements to it. And again, I thank both Laura and Zach for the richness of their presentation. And not surprisingly, it ignited certain thoughts in my mind, and I'm very happy for that.
Wonderful. So if anyone else wants to contribute, feel free to unmute yourself and bring comment. Otherwise, I had a couple things I could. Ooh, okay, hold on. I'm getting a message. Rami, would you like to speak? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Lenny, for this book. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I'm looking forward to read it. The question I have for you is this: in the long debate on not on which translation is the better one, but which is more authoritative, the Septuagint or the Masoretic text. Where are we now in this debate?
If I understand correctly, you're asking which of these is more likely to represent the original text, the text in its earliest date, and to paraphrase some phrase, as many scholars as there are, as many views as there are. And it varies not just from translator to translator, but from book to book. So for example, take the book I know the best, Joshua. Joshua is not a book which is radically different in the Greek than in the Hebrew, but it is shorter in the Greek by 4%, and it's got lots and lots of changes. And some people believe those changes are the result of the translators having in front of them a Hebrew text, which was different from our traditional text. Others believe it's more the result of translators updating, revising, and changing the text to make it better, because when we think of scribes as copyists, yes, but they weren't inert. They changed things as they went along. So the debate is fluid and it changes. And in a sense, it's a really good example of, I don't know if we could call it objective subjectivism, because ultimately, and I realized this early on in my, ultimately it's subjective. How do I feel? I feel that the Greek translators of the book of Joshua stayed very close to the Hebrew they had. And I have evidence to show this, this, and this. Someone else has the same evidence, has no different evidence, and they look at it in a different way. And I'm not dogmatic about it. It's a really important question. And the short answer, which of course you wouldn't expect from me right away, but the short answer is that it differs from book to book. And it's not an issue, I think, which is susceptible to a dogmatic conclusion, which I hold that view dogmatically.
Thank you.
Where's my, oh, I am on. I thought I was on mute. Sorry about that. So I'm curious, actually, when I spoke with the professors before this session, oh, wait, okay, Marty Schukert has a question, so I want to highlight him because he always has good stuff to say. I'm going to add him. Marty, please share.
Well, my question, Leonard, jumps to the end of the book. Not that I read the last page and claim that I read the book, but which I have. But and it is a fantastic one. It's just absolutely engaging thing to read, and just presents a tremendous exposition of the whole history of Jewish Bible translations, and I feel like I'm a lot smarter as a result of reading the book. But my question dealt with your idea of where Jewish Bible translations go in the future. And the book, of course, identifies three general trends. One is a new Orthodox translation, more individual translations like the Altar Bible, and continuing use of the new JPS. What do you think are the tasks that still need to be done? How can these 2,000 years of translation history be further embellished and innovated on and expanded?
Thank you, Marty. That's a great question, and I don't want to take make any great claims about a prophecy, in this case foretelling. Little did I know that in fact JPS has engaged on a revision of its own translation. I didn't know that at the time. It was one of the things I figured would happen. And the translations will reflect changes in Jewish community, changes in Jewish scholarship. And part of this, just to briefly point out, many of you, of course, are familiar with Bob Alter's translation or Dick Freeman's translation or Everett Fox's translation. These individual translations are nothing new in the sense that individual Jews have been doing translations close to forever. But what's interesting is that Everett, Bob, and Dick, wonderful people that they are not within the Jewish community. They're not leaders within the Jewish community. And all the translators that we've had beforehand were part of the Jewish community. Now, this represents a freedom and a liberation because Bob and Dick and Everett have realized that the general public, the general scholarly public, and the general public at large is interested in Jewish Bible translations. And I suspect that we'll see more of that. I don't think that there's any organization with the resources to produce another translation by committee. It used to be, and by used to be, I mean within the 20th century, that translators did this work pro bono, if I can use an expression. I mean, they didn't get paid to be translators. They worked on it, and then there would be a yearly conference or something. But that was, and I don't know that that model is around anymore. I don't know. I guess it's not so much I don't know where we might go, as it is that I'm intrigued to see what will happen. The number of Orthodox translations is frequently, you might say, how many Orthodox translations do we need? That's really not the question. Many of the Orthodox translations are specific to a particular group and have the approval of that particular group. For example, we might have thought that among Chabad Jews, why would you need a Bible translation? But Bible translations, particular Bible translations, figure prominently in the Chabad ritual these days. I recognize that, for example, the fact that there were no women doing Jewish Bible translation until the 1970s was a lack. It wasn't that people, I don't think it was that the translators said, oh no, we guys can handle it. Maybe they did. They didn't think about it. The JPS translation, the one that we continue to use today, is the first one that involves females as well as males, and there've been a number of other translation by females. I'm excited about it, and what I'm looking for would be something that acknowledges the tradition and then builds on it. And that might be a freer translation, might be a more literal translation. Certainly, there's the different modes of translation. The different modes of production, the interactive translations. There are translations that have been done essentially like wikis, where you're welcome to come to put in your own version. Of one thing, I can be certain, Jenny. One thing I can be certain, and two things. One is the number of Bible translations will not be diminished. It is primarily a Protestant phenomenon, but with the Roman Catholic translations, their Jewish translations, and their ecumenical translations. The number of translations and the sale of translations, which is another story that I've written about. It's an amazing story in and of itself. So I think we're in for What do you fasten your seatbelt? We're in for a bump. I don't know, we're in for a bumpy ride. I hope not, but we're in for a good ride. Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Leonard. And I think I'm going to have to thank our guest speakers and move on to our closing remarks, because I've just been reminded that it is around that time. So thank you so much, Professor Smith and Alexander.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
I appreciate the connections you've made, and I'm grateful to have you as part of our community here. So I am now going to invite Mr. Stephen J. Riekes. Did I get the middle initial right? I always want to say J. I think it's true.
Good.
All right. So I'm putting you on the spotlight, and I'm welcoming you to share some closing remarks.
Thank you very much. It has really been an honor and a privilege to spend this afternoon learning from Professor Greenspoon and his colleagues. And I want to say too, it's been a privilege to have and work with both officially and as a friend, Leonard Greenspoon, over these many years. And I congratulate him, as all of us had, on the occasion of the publication of his new book, and for all of the things he's done for our community. I want to give a little background for some of the people who may be on this tribute, may not know. What are the origins of the Philip and Ethel Klutznick Chair in Jewish Civilization at Creighton University? The origins dealing with Phil Klutznick, and who is Phil Klutznick, by the way, just very briefly. He was a lawyer, a graduate of Creighton Law School. He came up with the idea of the Omaha Housing Authority and served under Presidents Roosevelt and then Truman in public housing, and then he became a developer and developed Park Forest, Illinois, and the water tower in Chicago and places all over. He became Secretary of Commerce under the Carter administration and ambassador of the United States to UNESCO, and many other things. But the important thing is he always had a special concern and love of Creighton University. Why was that? That was because when, in the first half of the past century, Jews like Philip Klutznick were discriminated against. In many places, they couldn't go to a particular university, or they couldn't go except if they fit into a numerical quota. This was very, very common around the United States. But a Jesuit Catholic university in Omaha, Nebraska said, we'll have none of that. We don't apply quotas. We welcome our Jewish students. And people like Phil Klutznick and so many others in the Omaha Jewish community and elsewhere have been grateful to Creighton for the opportunity which Creighton gave them to be educated. And Phil Klutznick never forgot that. So when the times passed, he came up with an idea. He endowed a chair at Creighton University called the Klesnick Chair in Jewish Civilization, with some very unusual features. One feature that's important is that he wanted the holder of the chair not just to occupy an academic, ivory tower, but to participate in the Jewish community itself and the community at large. And by that vision that he had, he intended and hoped for the Catholic community of Creighton to come together and in terms of learning with the Jewish community of Omaha. And I must say that Leonard Greenspoon has fulfilled that tremendous bridge building vision of Phil Klutznick. I want to thank you, Leonard, for all your contributions along those lines and acting as I knew the Klutznicks hoped that this would come about. You have fulfilled a wonderful vision, and I wish you a lot of continued success and mazel tov, and we hope that we will continue to be the recipients of your knowledge, your friendliness, your humor, and all the wonderful things that make you such a good person and a mensch. Thank you very much, mazel tov, Leonard Greenspoon.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. So before we close, I wanted to make sure I do ensure you all know that Leonard has secured quite a nice discount for you all if you'd like to purchase his book. So I'm going to put that in the chat. You also should have gotten it with your registration, but I just wanted to not overlook the opportunity. I bought it full price because I didn't know, right? So I just bought it on the day it was available, but happy that I did so. I'm curious, Leonard, would you like to share anything before I was going to also just unmute all lines so that we could have a little, we could pretend we've closed this celebration and we're out in the gallery area like it's the Klutznick, and I've handed you some sparkling wine. So I hope you all are here. Ask all to unmute. There we go.
If I could say just one more thing.
Please.
I'm a little reluctant about this. You may have noticed that I have something up here, sort of a scar, and looks like, do not be worried. I was running my own business, having lunch outside of the restaurant in Omaha 2 weeks ago. And then somebody came by and made some very belligerent remarks about Bible translations. Before you knew it, that was just a fight that started. I have a little bit of a scar. You should see what happened to him. I'm perfectly fine, and don't worry. And I am now in Connecticut. I'm in Ellie's fantastic and stable hands, and I'm feeling great. Thank you so much.
That's great. Leonard, when you first came to Omaha, and when I was introduced that your field was Bible translations, I thought, oh my goodness, is this going to be somebody in extreme, arcane academia? What are we going to do? And then you told a story then. You said that there was a Southern governor who commented on the King James Version of the Bible as follows. He said, if the King James Version of the Bible was good enough for Jesus, he was good enough for me. So I thought, all right, you're the kind of guy we need.
That's actually, Steve, that's an interesting story. I don't want to go into it a lot. It's apparently a movable story, which means it was told originally about I can't remember her name. She was governor of Texas after her husband's death, which she probably engineered. But the story was told to other people as well. And I asked somebody one day, and we went through the 10 or so people to whom that story had been attributed. And the person I was talking to eliminated 8 of them. There's no, it couldn't be that person, it couldn't be that person. But yeah, it was, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. And you can't beat it.
I'm gonna just stop up.
I'm pretty sure the governor in question was Governor Hogg with 2 G's.
Only Marty would know that.
But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Leonard. And
Thank you and
Jenny,
congratulations.
everybody, and Alan and the Federation for helping to put on this afternoon's program. It's a delight.
Steve, you're welcome. It came from your spark. So we're all lucky to have the Klesnick Committee leading us in Jewish learning in our community. You, Marty, Leonard, have done a significant job in keeping us focused. So thank you to everybody. Jenny, thank you for leading us today.